And so we have a system that reflects the monopolization of politics by two pro-capitalist parties who hand each other the government every few years in a ritual of political make-believe.
The solution is to democratize the enterprise, to bring democracy to the enterprise and say, if the mass of people collectively in each enterprise made the decision of that enterprise, we wouldn't have the inequality we have today, we wouldn't have the loss of jobs, we would have a radically different economy, one that actually solved these problems rather than spinning our wheels, trying something that fails again. The decision makers are the board of directors, 12 to 20 people. The major shareholders, 12 to 20 people, 24 people. How many folks work at General Motors? 100,000. Whoops. 100,000 people take orders. 100,000 people live with the results of decisions over which they have no authority whatsoever. A capitalist corporation is an anti-democratic institution, isn't it? And for those of you who don't know, in the 1930s and 40s, there was a very powerful alliance of the union movement and the communists and the socialists. Big one, very successful. The unions organized something called the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organization, the most successful union organizing drive in the history of the United States. Again, we've never had anything like it before, we've never had anything like it since. And that was helped by the communists and the socialists, two socialist parties, one communist party, that worked closely with the labor unions and did all of that, including big things here in St. Louis and Kansas City, as in all American basic cities. Part of our history. And if you don't know about it, you got a problem with how our history is taught to us, or rather, not taught to us. And at the end of the war, again for your history, at the end of the war, the right wing, the corporations, who were horrified by what they had been taxed, and the rich who were horrified by what they had been taxed, they knew they had to undo this. And at the end of the war was now over, the president died about the same time, and now it's late 1945 and 46, and the right wing says, our problem wasn't Roosevelt. He would never have done this. He's a son of a good American family with another president a while ago. He did that because he was pressured by the unions and the communists, and he was right. So they reached a strategy which the right won. We have to get rid of the communists and the socialists and the unions. And they went to work to do that. We went around America and we taught the American people that, you know, the socialists, they're really like the communists. They just spell it differently. We made Americans think that if a left-wing effort is made to get you to go to a meeting or to do something, you should back away. It's gonna cost you. We are still humbled by that. That's why Americans who believe the way so many of us do don't do anything, because we're scared. We don't admit it, we don't understand it. It comes from that period of history, and it has sunk real deep into the American psyche.
The CEOs of these corporations, you know that the $15 an hour movement in this country is mostly concentrated in the retail industry and the restaurant industry. And if you take a look at what the CEOs get in those industries, all of their executives, if you work it out for the hours, get paid a little over $9,000 an hour. So, appreciate America. People earning $9,000 an hour do not want to allow their employees to get $15 an hour. And they're determined to make that fight. Wow. Makes you want to go to church, doesn't it? It's so deeply moving. Think of the family values that these people are committed to. Wow. What? Let me remind you, the bottom half, 3.5 billion people, those are the people who die long before they need to, who don't get the medical care that we know how to deliver to them. who live in housing that's unspeakable, with unsanitary water. And we have a system in which 62 people have more wealth than what could ameliorate the living conditions of 3.5 billion people. Which of you has an ethical, moral, or religious commitment to values of such a system? You preserve capitalism? Why? It rips you off. For those of you, by the way, I noticed a couple of you reacting when I mentioned the debts to go through college. Even in capitalism, you don't need to do that. You don't just live in capitalism here in the United States. You live in a virulent form of it. Here's a central statistic, perhaps the most important one I can talk to you about this evening, to remember. The wages of Americans in the 1970s stopped rising. That is, what you get adjusted for the prices you pay is the same today in 2012 that it was in 1978. No increase in real wages. Flat. Now, if I had time, and I don't, I could tell you what it must have been like in many people's minds, including yours, to be part of a country that for 150 years had come to believe something was in the cards for them. Something was built into this society. Your chance to work, your chance to do better, your chance, your chance, your chance. What happens to such a culture, ours, if it's over? It stops. Well, if I were a psychologist, I would say that causes a trauma. And the trauma is worse, as is the case with all traumas in life, if you can't talk about it, if there's no one to discuss it with, no one to commiserate with you about it. And as a nation, we didn't recognize it, we didn't talk about it, and not a single president to this date has ever gone to the American people to talk about it. So the American people tried to handle it individually. And if some of this is beginning to sound like it's a little bit the story of you and your family, good, it should. Because I really am talking about you and me. It's always a very sad thing when human beings try to solve a social problem with an individual decision. You're going to solve a social problem, you need a social movement. 500 corporations do 2/3 of the business in the United States. We have to figure out a way that they won't get angry at the system which has failed to provide them with a job. Solution? Meritocracy. School, university. So why do we do it? Because we have to make sure that the employer can give the job to the one with an A. Why? Because the ones with B's and C's will then blame themselves for not getting the job, rather than the system that has failed to provide them with work. It's a political issue. The reality is, it's one of the many mechanisms that takes a failed system and transforms the failure, not of the system, which we could change, but of something in you that's inadequate. It is a cruel form of torture. And those of you that suffer from it, and everyone in this room to some degree has this in their lives. And if you don't think so, you need to think about it some more. The system can be changed. The movement around the world now to change this system is greater than anything I have seen in my lifetime. We have a system in which a tiny group of people, the board of directors of a corporation, 15 to 20 persons on a board. How do you get to be on the board? You're elected by the shareholders. 1% of Americans own 75% of the shares. That 1% decides who's on the board of directors. They make all the decisions. Do you have a job or not? What do you get paid? Will your job be moved to China next month? Will the profits you help to produce be used in a way that you have any control over? The answer is unambiguous. An enterprise is a fundamentally undemocratic institution, which is bizarre, isn't it? Because adults live most of their lives at work. 5 out of 7 days, the best hours of the day, you're at work. If you have a commitment to democracy, the first place it should have been instituted is your workplace, not the last. We live in a country that has never introduced democracy to the workplace. We fight wars in other countries to bring them a democracy we don't have. A group of people in the ACLU with their interest in economic justice, which I find wonderful to see. I'm in favor of all of that. But there's a lesson we have to learn about it. To do reforms in a capitalist system, but to leave the system in place, is to leave in place the mechanism that undoes the reform. And you've got to ask yourself then whether it's enough to make a reform that doesn't also change the system to make the reform secure, rather than to create the very antipathy. Everything Roosevelt did, however much you applaud it, produced the enemy of that reform. It produced the businessman or woman outraged by what had just been done and therefore committed to undo it. It taxed wealthy people who then were furious and went to work to support all of the institutions that have since undone all of that. So the conclusion is, and this is the final thing for me tonight, what do you do to change the system in such a way that the reforms won by the struggles of people, what changes do you do that might enable those to be permanent, to be secure, to be things that people have won that they won't then lose 5 or 10 years down the road? And for me, there's only one answer I know. And it's not the answer you might have expected. My answer is not the answer that traditional critics of capitalism thought would be the solution, which is to have the government do this or that. Have the government take over the enterprise, have the government substitute planning for the market, the things that the Soviet Union, China, and so on did. It's not that. Seems to me what's happened in those two societies, Russia and China, is more a model of what we shouldn't do than what we should do. I think that has to be said as part of facing a reality. So what is it? We have to change the organization of business. That's what we have to do. We have to change the enterprise, the institution that produces goods and services. What happened over the last 30 years is really what I want to finish this up with. The United States shifted in the last 30 to 40 years radically away from everything Roosevelt did. It's as if the last 30 or 40 years could be described by the phrase, roll back the New Deal. In 1945, end of the war, for every dollar in income tax that the federal government earned by taxing individuals, it got $1.50 in taxing corporations. So the total take from corporations was 50% more than the total take from individuals. Today, the same proportion, for every dollar taxed in individuals, the corporations pay 25 cents. That's where it is. Oh, that's a tax cut. That is a wonderful tax cut. Not for you, but for them. The last 50 years have been then what? Rolling back the tax on corporations and shifting it to individuals. And rolling back the tax on rich individuals and putting it instead on all of you. Whatever else is going on, this capitalism may be on life support, but the rich are making money all the same. Never let a good crisis or a good pandemic go to waste. That's the real slogan of U.S. private capitalism.